because I'm working off of Holly's desk at the moment, which is pretty, but it's an Instagram desk, and it's literally covered in cactuses, so you can't like plug things into the computer without stabbing yourself with a cactus. Welcome back to We Love the Internet. My name's Harrison.
And I'm Chris.
And we are two nerdy geeks, or geeky nerds, who love to find out silly stuff on the internet. And at the moment, due to the coronavirus lockdown, we're having a lot of extra time to find fun and interesting facts. So we thought we'd share them with you guys. How's it going, Chris?
Yeah, all good, thank you. I'm in lockdown along with everybody else in the country. From there, getting there. How about you?
Yeah, about the same. So as we record, we're in basically week 2 of self-isolation.
Yes.
We've just had our government in the UK announce that we have to stay at home now for, well, no one really knows how long, but I think it's going to be a while, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. They're saying 3 weeks initially, but I don't believe them.
No, I think it's going to be significantly longer than 3 weeks, but there we go. It's giving us a good opportunity to get our gardening and DIY projects done that we've been putting off for the last couple of years that we've been in this house. Oh,
cool. So you're in the garden, you're out in the sunshine?
Yes. I've been pulling up horrific weeds and attacking, well, like I say, at least a year and a half's worth of neglect that we've subjected our garden to, so it's well overdue.
Quite a bit of growth then.
Yes, yeah, we're piling copious amounts of weed killer on everything and just hoping for the best. That's mostly our strategy.
You carpet bombing it.
Yeah, when in doubt, just napalm the bastard and let nature sort it out.
Yeah, pretty much. I know that feeling.
I did also try and change a tap today, thinking I was going to be really clever. Went and switched off the water to the house. Mm-hmm. And then switched on the tap and it was still on. So I don't know whether I'm tapped into the neighbour's water supply or whether there's another water clog I need to find somewhere. But that was a good half an hour's worth of head scratching trying to work out where this bloody tap's getting its water from.
I know less than nothing about plumbing, right? But when my dad has done it before for me, he's had to drain the entire system. It's like a tank in the roof or something. Yeah. I don't know if you have that.
No, I don't think we do.
Oh, so you just go straight from the mains?
Yeah, and every other tap in the house stopped working.
Oh!
Except this one bloody outdoor tap.
Part of the one you wanted.
Yeah. So I have no idea where that's getting its water from. I feel like I should probably look into that.
Probably is the neighbours then.
Yeah, it's fine. We'll just use it to fill up a swimming pool or something later on.
Sounds about right. So what else are you going to do with the garden? Are you just clearing the weeds and stuff to get it back to like grass or whatever?
Yeah, so we're clearing off a whole load of weeds down one side, and then we've got fence panels that are literally falling over. One of them one of the panels fell down last year when we had those storms. So that needs replacing. Sticking a shed down there and building a pond, which is why I needed the tap to work.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, just a casual couple of hours worth of work. Nothing major.
Fair enough. It's obviously spring now, so it's getting a little bit warmer, much sunnier. Well, the last few days anyway.
Yeah, I have to confess, it was actually quite a nice way to spend an afternoon. I got to vent some of my anger on these big, deep weeds that were stuck deep in the ground. But it was actually kind of quite nice to be outside in the sun and in nature.
Fair enough.
Before coming back and staring at my computer screen for hours of emails, it was a nice distraction.
Yes, definitely. Well, I know what you mean, because last year I was clearing my garden, and I know what you mean about weeds and hedges and spiky plants and things. God, I had so many spiky hedges in my garden to deal with, and the roots were just there's loads of them. So yeah, they're all out now. So yes, I feel your pain.
And it is quite satisfying to sit back at the end of a day's work and see the bin of garden waste that we filled up with all these things and the clear area that we've made. At least you feel like you've achieved something. Yeah,
definitely. It makes a real big difference, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah. I completely destroyed that feeling by then completely failing to switch off that bloody tap. But
it's all still running now, is it?
No. I gave up in the end and just walked away. That's a job for tomorrow.
You might have that swimming pool by tomorrow. You never know.
Well, yeah, you never know. I think I've got enough time. I can deal with it another day.
Yeah, fair enough. So, what else are you doing to stay off boredom in this lockdown that we've got going on?
Well, I've told myself I'm going to do all those things like read all those books I've been meaning to read and play those games I've been meaning to play, but mostly it's just been kind of sitting around, not really doing very much. I think I'm going to have time to get into the swing of things, but I'm trying to not give myself too much to do and just kind of keep it realistic, but hopefully we will get something done. How about you?
Yeah, it's essentially working away, but I think I've got more of a social life in the evenings now than I ever did before this lockdown happened. I'm not quite sure what's going on.
Yeah, the amount of WhatsApp groups I'm in all of a sudden and Slack channels has dramatically increased.
Yeah, that's right. And on like Friday and Saturday night last week, I was playing with a bunch of mates Jackbox. So essentially, it's an online tool. We're using Discord to talk, and then somebody was sharing their screen that had hosted the games, and so all these sort of silly games that you can do on your phone, and then they've sort of obviously the answers come up on the screen. The other person sharing. It was really good fun. Spent a couple of years doing that, and we obviously got a pandemic game we're both playing, aren't we? Pandemic Legacy. We're going to start.
Starting our first proper session tomorrow as we record now.
That's right.
Yeah, so that should be exciting.
Hopefully we can kill the virus. I'm not sure we're going to be able to, based on our previous game.
We completely eradicated the 2 weakest viruses.
That's true, we did.
And then the other 2 completely overwhelmed us and killed us quite dramatically.
Yes, they did. Hopefully that's not something's going to happen in the real world.
No, hopefully not.
But yeah, basically keep myself as busy as I can. I think just it's a nice, obviously lighter evenings, and with the time going forward this coming weekend or next weekend, whenever it's going to be soon. It should make things a little bit better anyway. Yes,
well, that's our intention for making our garden a bit nicer. We'll actually hopefully end up using it rather than just being stuck inside us. I think if we get a spout of rain, it's going to be a bit of a miserable time if we can't actually leave the house.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it makes sense, definitely. Good idea.
It's going to be a problem. Right, enough jibber jabbing.
Yes, onwards to learning.
Onwards to learning and fun.
Okay, I'm going to go first. I'm going to tell you all about Typhoid Mary today. Do you know who Typhoid Mary is?
I know the name, but I don't really know anything about her, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it is her. You're right. Absolutely, it was a real person, Mary Mallon. And before I get onto that, let's go through some other stuff about what typhoid is. I think because I'm over talking about COVID-19. I don't know about you, but let's talk about something slightly related, but not obviously what we're dealing with right now.
We're going to be on a theme at least.
Yeah, exactly. We're on trend, if nothing else. So, obviously we've become accustomed to a lot of different terms over the last few weeks and months, among them social distancing, self-isolation and super spreaders. But one of the most famous super spreaders in the past, a woman called Mary Mallon, Typhoid Mary. You've probably never heard of Mary, actually an actual person, obviously, but you probably have heard of her nickname, Typhoid Mary. But before we get on to her and the details of her very sad life, I want to tell you about what disease she was a super spreader for, that being typhoid. In the NHS in the UK describes typhoid in the following way. Typhoid is a bacterial infection that can spread throughout the body, affecting many organs. Without prompt treatment, it can cause complications that can be fatal. So yeah, really quite unpleasant.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. Typhoid is caused by a bacterium, called Salmonella typhi, which is related to the bacteria that causes salmonella food poisoning. The disease is highly contagious, and an infected person can pass the bacteria out of their body through their feces or, less commonly, in the urine. And if you catch typhoid fever, the main symptoms are a high temperature, headache, general aches and pains, a cough, and constipation. So it's really quite unpleasant.
Sounds really pleasant.
Yeah, absolutely. A bit like COVID-19, really.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, COVID-19, get it right. And if somebody eats any food or drinks any water and contaminated with a small amount of the infected feces or urine from somebody, they can become infected with bacteria and develop typhoid fever. So yeah, all round pretty nasty. Yeah. In fact, without any treatment, it's estimated that 1 in 5 people will die of the condition, and so obviously that's 20% of those who contract typhoid, which makes it a rather deadly disease. However, if the disease is treated early enough with modern antibiotics, the infection is likely to be mild and treated at home within a week or two. That's obviously great news for anybody who catches that nowadays.
Yeah.
In addition to the antibiotics, there are actually 2 vaccines available to protect people, but obviously over time it's not been necessary to sort of administer those vaccines unless you're travelling to developing countries where you can still catch the disease. So probably good to let's hear it from modern science at this point, really. So that's pretty good, really, where we are right now.
Yeah.
But of course, there weren't these treatments. There wasn't antibiotics, and there wasn't these vaccines to protect people from typhoid fever when Mary Mallon was alive, which sort of subsequently turned out, contributed to the way her life turned out. Really, she was born in 1869 in County Tyrone in Ireland, and at the time it was one of the poorest areas in the country, and she is believed to have emigrated to New York in her teens in either 1883 or 1884. Once she got to New York, she lived with her aunt and uncle, and she initially found work as a domestic servant. Mary found after a while that she was actually talented at cooking, so she started getting employed as a domestic cook rather than other domestic service positions, and she must be really good because she's ended up becoming a cook for some of the most affluent families in New York. Now, Mary didn't know this at the time, until quite a bit later actually, but she's actually a carrier, an asymptomatic carrier for Salmonella typhi, and the bacteria that causes typhoid fever. Yeah, pretty bad. And I say she didn't know this at the time.
Particularly if you're a chef and a cook, that's not a...
Well, it's not a good combination, is it? Really, probably one of the worst combinations.
Yeah.
Other than that being in healthcare, perhaps. But she may never have known it, because she was considered to be in a picture of complete health and had never contracted typhoid, and so at least until later in life, she could never have suspected that she was an asymptomatic carrier because there were just no symptoms, basically.
Yeah.
So how did she come to find out she was a typhoid carrier, or typhoid fever carrier, sorry? Well, in 1906, a wealthy banker by the name of Charles Henry Warren took his family on their summer holiday to Oyster Bay in Long Island, where he hired a house from a guy called George Thompson and his wife. Warren employed Mary as their cook for this holiday. On the 27th of August, so I guess it doesn't really say, but I'm imagining sometime in the middle of their holiday, one of Warren's daughters became ill with typhoid fever, and within days, 6 of the 11 people in the house also came down with illness. So it's pretty horrible.
Pretty fast spreading.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the time, typhoid fever was associated with poverty, lack of basic sanitation, and the slums in New York. So, because Warren's household came down with it in the playground of the rich and famous, Thompson, who was the landlord that had rented the house to Warren, was really concerned, for obvious reasons, that his house would become known for giving people typhoid, and he wouldn't be able to rent the house out in the future.
Thinking with his wallet, not for the
oh, absolutely, yeah.
concern of his guests.
I mean, the guests recovered. It's fine, well, it doesn't matter.
Again, also sounding quite familiar to things that we're hearing at the moment.
Indeed, it's always about the money, isn't it?
Yeah.
So George Thompson hired a guy called George Soper, who was a freelance sanitary engineer, to investigate the cause of the outbreak. Soper investigated everything from the house's plumbing all the way through to the local shellfish supply, but he couldn't find anything that was responsible for the outbreak. So then he moved on to investigating Mary and her employment history to see if he could find out more. I mean, obviously, initially, I guess you could say, why was he investigating Mary? Because she's a cook. Why it's possible, from what they knew at the time, that maybe she could have been transmitting it, but they didn't really know about asymptomatic carriers at the time. So, and in addition to that, obviously the temperatures required to cook the food that she was cooking would have killed the bacteria. So obviously, I mean, I'm guessing you'll probably get this from when I keep talking, but you'll probably find that Soper is a pretty dogged sanitary engineer at this point, because he obviously keeps looking, and he actually finds the answer, or he thinks he finds the answer in Mary Mallon's most popular dessert, which is ice cream with raw peaches cut up into it and frozen in it. So he thinks that obviously the raw peaches, she's handled these raw peaches, put them into the ice cream, and then that's how the guests have contracted the disease. So Soper tracks Mary's employment history back to 1900, so at this point 6 years prior, and finds out that the typhoid outbreaks have followed her from one job to the next. In fact, he obviously continues investigating into 1907. So from 1900 to 1907, Soper finds that Mary has worked 7 jobs during that time, in which 22 people become ill, and that's included the death of one little girl.
Oof.
Yeah, so not ideal at all. And he obviously at this point he speculates that the bacteria has been passed on because Mary isn't washing her hands properly enough, and before she's preparing food.
Right.
Which seems obviously very logical to us in the 21st century, and probably seemed very logical to him as he came up with the theory. But obviously he couldn't prove it until he obtained stool and blood samples. Now, he tracked Mary down in 1907 to the home of Walter Brown and his family, where he asked Mary for the required samples. And I'll let Soper describe in his own words how that went with Mary. Okay, so this is what he said. It did not take long for Mary to react to the suggestion. She seized a carving fork and advanced in my general direction. I passed rapidly down the long, narrow hall, through the iron gate, and so onto the sidewalk. I felt rather lucky to escape. Jesus. So yeah.
So it's fair to say she wasn't keen on the idea.
No, Mary wasn't really very keen on being accused of spreading typhoid fever. I think you'll be fine. Yeah, I mean it's understandable because obviously she that's her living. She's a cook.
Yeah.
And if it's proven that she is spreading typhoid fever for whatever reason, then she's going to be very quickly out of a job.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, she got pretty angry and dealt with it accordingly. But Mary's violent outburst didn't stop there, and it certainly didn't stop our sanitary engineer, because he's very dogged, as I've said. He found out. So obviously, he previously visited Mary and had his encounter with her at her place of employment. So now he finds where she lives. So for some backup, he brings along his assistant, Dr. Bert Raymond Hubler, for some backup.
But don't blame him.
No, indeed. I think I'd probably take an army with me, to be honest with you. And this time round, as you can imagine, Mary is just as angry. Though rather than wielding a carving fork, she shouts expletives at them both until they are made until they make their hurried escape, probably back to the sidewalk again, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're alluding to it. But can you imagine how well an Irish woman can handle herself? She's obviously not forward, not bad about coming forwards, I would say.
No. I was going to say he's probably happy that she'd resorted to harsh words instead of pulling a meat cleaver or something.
That's right. Yeah, escalating her response.
Yeah.
Too right. So he's not obviously getting very far with her. So he decides to take another approach to this problem. He goes and raises his game, and he goes to the New York City Health Department, and he talks to a man called Herman Briggs. And Briggs agrees with Soper's hypothesis that Mary is probably the carrier for this, but obviously again they need the stool samples and blood samples to prove this is correct. So Briggs sends Dr. S. Josephine Baker to talk to Mary and acquire the samples. Now, I'm sure by now you can imagine how this went down. Essentially, Mary refused to listen to Dr. Baker, and so she was sent away. She went away, and she came back mob-handed with 5 police officers and an ambulance. So Baker wasn't hanging around.
No.
I'll let Baker describe what happened next. Mary was on the lookout and peered out, a long kitchen fork in her hand like a rapier. She's back to the kitchen fork again.
Trusty weapon.
Oh yeah, if you know how to use something, you've got to get it in your hand. As she lunged at me with the fork, I stepped back, recoiled on the policeman, and so confused matters that by the time we got through the door, Mary had disappeared. Disappear is too matter-of-fact a word. She had completely vanished.
Wow. So
what had actually happened is Mary had hot-footed over a neighbour's fence. And she got out of there. But she didn't go too far because the police spent the next 5 hours searching both properties until they... They really, really looked. I don't know if they were cups of coffee in the meantime. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, 5 hours. 5 hours looking for her in 2 properties. I mean, I can't imagine these places were very big. Maybe they were flats. I don't know. It's not described what they were. But anyway, they spent 5 hours looking for Mary, and they eventually found her in a closet. So
Classic.
now, yeah, absolutely classic hiding place. Back to Baker to describe what happened next. She came out fighting and swearing, both of which she could do with appalling efficiency and vigour.
That's beautifully described.
It really is. You can just imagine her penning this report, can't you, afterwards. I made another effort to talk sensibly to her and asked her again to let me have the specimens, but it was of no use. By this time, she was convinced the law was wantonly prosecuting her, and she wanted nothing, and she had done nothing wrong. She knew she had never contracted typhoid fever. She was maniacal in her integrity. There was nothing I could do but take her with us. The policeman lifted her into the ambulance, and I literally sat on her all the way to the hospital. It was like being in a cage with an angry lion. You can just imagine the scene, can't you? 1907, really quite verbal and abusive, getting carried to the ambulance and sat down and sat upon. Yeah, it's a good look, isn't it?
That's incredible.
Poor Mary.
I mean, I'm not sure I blame her for feeling like the police were prosecuting her.
No,
She has been quite doggedly folled around and been sat on after being arrested by 5 police officers.
That's right. They have not given up. Between Soap and the police officer, they've got her well and truly. So, once back at the hospital and with the blood and stool sample safety taken, I mean, they didn't describe how they took these blood and stool. I mean, she's probably tied down to us at this point. I don't know.
Yeah.
The results confirmed Mary was indeed carrying salmonella type. The health authorities at this point decided to intern Mary in an isolated cottage, which was past the Riverside Hospital in North Brother Island. I believe it was about 16 acres, so it's quite large. But I mean, you know, she was interned. I suspect she was probably told to stay in this isolated cottage and just stay on her own, basically. So it's pretty harsh. Now, Mary hadn't committed any crimes or broken any laws, so why were the authorities allowed to hold her against her will? They were using 2 sections of the Greater New York Charter, which they believed enabled them to detain any sick person with contagious pestilential or infectious disease. I don't know if I've said that correctly. Probably not.
Carry on.
At the time, they believed the healthy carriers far more dangerous than those who were sick with the disease, because there was nowhere there to identify them visually. And obviously, if anybody had the symptoms, they would obviously self-isolate like we're doing nowadays, or they would be avoided by healthy people. You know, you're not going to go close to somebody who's exhibiting, sickness, are you?
No.
So that's why they basically stuck her in an isolated cottage. Obviously, Mary thought this was completely unfair, as she'd never contracted typhoid fever or spread the disease, let alone contributed to killing the little girl. This obviously, she was first interned in 1907, and then in 1909 she sued the health department. So this is 2 years later. She's been interned for 2 years at this point. So it's pretty harsh in this little cottage on this North Brother Island. And so she sues the New York Health Department in the Supreme Court, which, fair enough.
True American style.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the only way forward. So she sued for her freedom, essentially. And she used evidence of her own stool samples that had been collected every week at the hospital. They've been doing that anyway and testing them. And she sent some of them off to a private laboratory, and they come back as negative for typhoid. I don't know exactly how many they took in the end, but they took them over the 2-year period, once a week. Right. And some of them came back negative from the hospital authorities and some came back positive. But the ones that she had tested in the private laboratory came back negative. Unfortunately for Mary, though, the judge denied her petition, which meant she had to return to the isolated cottage on North Brother Island with little hope of ever being released. So she's, by this point, 2 years, gone to court and then still said no, this is it. This is her rest of her life as far as she can see it in the future.
Yeah.
Right, so 1910 rolls around, so another year, so 3 years now. And with it, a new health commissioner decides that Mary should be allowed to go free only if she agrees to never cook again, cook for other people.
What an incredible stipulation. That's all he cares about.
That's right, yeah, exactly.
You may never cook again.
No, only for yourself. So she obviously readily accepts this requirement because she's obviously anxious to be free and subsequently released on the 19th of February. So 3 years in isolation, basically, and she's allowed to go. After initially working as a laundress as well as several other jobs, she eventually goes back to being a cook. Now, there aren't any documents or documentation as to why this happened, but I guess we can speculate that she, doing other jobs other than a cook for wealthy families didn't pay as well, or she simply enjoyed cooking more. We just can't say. We don't know.
Yeah.
So she got released in 1910. At some point she went back to being a cook, and then in 1915, so 5 years later, she's working for the Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan.
Oh.
Yep, and the hospital has a typhoid fever outbreak. 25 people fall ill and 2 of them die. So it never said who died or who fell ill, but I'm imagining, being a maternity hospital, you can imagine it probably was pregnant women.
Yeah.
I can't say for sure though, so which is not good, obviously.
No.
And obviously the health authorities investigated. They pretty quickly found the evidence that pointed them to a recently employed cook called Mrs. Brown. Now, Brown was in fact Mary Mallon using a pseudonym, which is obviously less than ideal, which means she knew what she was doing was wrong if she's using a pseudonym. So she was pretty quickly and roundly abused in the press. I think she was given the nickname Typhoid Mary before, when she was first discovered as being an asymptomatic carrier. But obviously, with this situation whereby she's infected a bunch of people knowingly, used a pseudonym to hide who she was and get employed there as a cook, the press roundly turned on her. Public opinion and press roundly turned on her. And so
it's funny, you think about that now and you think someone who's been in that public a court case and had that kind of a thing would then never be able to work again as like a chef or anything, because everyone would know exactly what she looked like, and they would know the court case, whatever. But I guess in those days you could just move somewhere else, use a different name, and you're off to the races. Yeah,
I guess so. I mean, I don't know how initially. I mean, typhoid was a big problem in obviously the early 20th century. So I'd imagine it was probably quite a big news. But like you say, I mean, this had been five. Well, by the time this happened in Sloan Maternity Hospital, it was 5 years later. Yeah. So she may have changed her haircut, who knows, aged slightly. People, there wasn't the pervasive communication we have nowadays. Yeah. So obviously life moved on, I guess, and people forgot. I don't really know.
It's crazy.
It is crazy, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so she was roundly abused in the press again. Typhoid Mary, obviously, I would imagine that, like I say, that the nickname was first used back in 1907 when she was first caught. But yeah, obviously resurrected the nickname. And once they found out that it was her that had done this, had reinfected people at this hospital, she was once again sent to North Brother Island to live in the same isolated cottage where she'd stayed in a previous confinement. So yeah, back to where she was basically. And unfortunately for her, she remained there for 23 years. Jeez. Until her death at the age of 69 in November 1938. There's various pieces that say that she was quote unquote called a nurse and a hospital helper. So I think she was probably doing mundane duties in the hospital. It was never really sort of said what she was doing, and she also could only ever cook for herself. She wasn't allowed to cook for anybody else, because obviously she never actually experienced the symptoms of typhoid.
No.
I guess she must have been immune to it for whatever reason. And so although there were estimated to be thousands of asymptomatic carriers walking freely in the streets of New York in the years following Mary's detention, she was destined to live alone and in exile, mainly due to public opinion turning against her from the maternity ward incident.
Understandably.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously Typhoid Mary, the nickname came from the press nicknaming her that, and although we know the nickname today, we don't necessarily know why that's happened. So yeah, Mary had a very awful life, really. She obviously very, very lonely, and as much as we talked about it just now, being stuck in isolation on the rest of the country with our families and what have you for the next at least 3 weeks. At least we know we're going to get out of it sometime, and we are doing for the public, for the public good. But yeah, poor Mary, there was no way she was ever getting out, or she never did get out of internment, unfortunately.
No, and like you can. Trying to kind of like argue her case a little bit. I guess in the beginning, when you've got this mad doctor chasing you around demanding to take your blood and stool samples, it's kind of understandable to avoid that and not think that's very good. But then to be arrested and told this is what you're doing and you're making people sick enough to be put into isolation and trying to fight for your freedom, you can almost kind of understand. But then once all that's happened, to then go back to making food, particularly in a hospital, that's just crazy.
Absolutely,
that's very hard to defend.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what reading about her case. That's pretty much what a lot of people in the press thought. It was, kind of understand it the first time. A lot of people defended her the first time round, but then once she'd gone back to work after writing signing an affidavit that she wouldn't do that, and using a pseudonym to obviously get under the radar. Yeah, exactly, she knew what she was doing at that point. I mean, yeah, that is obviously terrible, and obviously those people became ill and 2 people died from that, and that is awful. But on the flip side, she was a very poor woman, and obviously she emigrated to New York from Ireland when in her teens, and so I would imagine she remained poor for her entire life. So she had no real way or the education or money to fight being interred for the rest of her life, unfortunately. So tragic all round. I mean, from the people who contracted the disease from her and died, and also her life as well. I mean, it's just absolutely awful.
And it's hard to think that she wouldn't have noticed all the people around her getting sick, and like all these people she knew being, because presumably that must have just happened all the time, like people she was working for or people she was working with or whatever.
Yes, there was inference that she had moved jobs every few weeks because of this reason. People would get sick, and so typhoid was fairly prevalent. Like I say, they assumed it was because of poor hygiene and in the slums and for poor people. Yeah. But if you kept following somebody, kept following her, maybe she just ignored it or didn't think it's not me. But she moved every few weeks, every few weeks from jobs onto the next household. So, I mean, the Warren family, where she obviously infected 6 people out of the household of 11. It was a summer holiday that she was working there for. So maybe she did gigs like that. Maybe it wasn't long term, always being employed by the wealthy family. Maybe she was working, just moving on. Who knows?
It kind of reminds me of my great aunt had a lodger living with her for a very long time who was an ex-bus driver, and he used to drive his car like he was driving a bus. And he would drive like an absolute maniac, and whenever you drove with him, you'd have all these people like beeping behind him and like honking their horns at him, and he was always convinced it was someone behind him who was driving badly. He was like, oh, some poor soul was getting it as he's like cutting people off in traffic. always absolutely convinced he's always just in front of the bad driver wherever he's going.
It's amazing what people convince themselves of.
Exactly, yeah. Oh man!
So that was a sad life of Mary Mallon, also known as Typhoid Mary.
Yeah. I mean, it's a shitty hand she got dealt in life.
Boom, Tish.
Yeah.
So what have you got for me?
Right. So I have got space-related stuff. Well, specifically spacesuits.
Oh.
So this Wikipedia Warren hole I got stuck in started with a post on Today I Learnt on Reddit, like most of my topics seem to do. How much do you think a standard NASA spacesuit costs?
Ooh, good question. A few mil, I would say. Let's say $10 million.
Close, $12 million.
Oh, okay. It's very expensive then.
Yes, they're very, very expensive. So I went on a little bit of a Wikipedia trip learning about all these various things about spacesuits and space in general. So your average, the current NASA spacesuit weighs around 280 pounds or 127 kilograms.
Wow, that's what very heavy.
Very, very heavy. Now, obviously, they're designed to be used in space. So once they get up there, they weigh nothing because there's no gravity. But yeah, down here, they've got a heck of a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah.
They are capable of protecting astronauts from temperatures ranging from minus 156 degrees Celsius to 121 degrees Celsius, and that's minus 250 Fahrenheit to 250 positive Fahrenheit. So a hell of a temperature range.
Yeah.
But they do actually kind of experience a lot of those temperatures in space, obviously depending on how close they are to the sun, or if which side of the Earth they're on to the sun, and that kind of thing.
And space is obviously very cold.
Exactly, it's very cold, but it also could be very hot as well. So they need that range.
Yes.
Now, the first ever suit used in space, obviously, was by Yuri Gagarin. It was called the SK-1 because all of these things are named by geeks. They all have incredibly boring names, which is something we've touched on before.
Yeah, that's right. The system 001.
Don't expect any catchy titles. Exactly. Yes. This was the SK-1, which I think pretty much translates as Spacesuit 1 in Russian.
Right.
Which is great. His one only weighed 20 kilograms because it's what's known as an IVA, or an intravehicular activity suit. So it's only worn inside the spaceship. So it doesn't need to provide you with like oxygen and all that kind of things.
Right.
So the other types they have are EVA, which stands for extravehicular activity suit, and IEVA, which is the intra and extravehicular suit. So nerds and their naming conventions coming in once again. Then there's also the orange suits that you see astronauts wearing when they're walking up to the spaceships.
Oh, yeah.
These are named the launch and entry suits. So I'll let you work out what they're used for.
It's lost on me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, it's you have to have a PhD to figure out what that one's for.
I think you do. Yeah, definitely.
So the list of requirements for what a spacesuit needs to do for you, particularly if it's the EVA suit, the big ones, it needs to keep a stable internal pressure. It needs to give you enough mobility to work, so when they're doing like spacewalks to go and fix parts of the spaceship, that kind of thing. Obviously, it's got to supply you with breathable oxygen.
Yeah, quite a kind of necessity.
Exactly, yeah. Regulate your temperature, provide communications, and because humans are gross, it needs to be able to collect and contain human waste. Both solid and
yes,
liquid.
Of course it does.
Yes.
They're a sealed system, aren't they? Whoa.
On the subject of which, when humans go into zero-G environments, the way your bladder works kind of stops working. So your bladder, when it gets to be about half full, sends you a message saying your bladder's full, you need to go to the toilet. Because that's kind of done on kind of like weight, and it pushing down on your bladder. When you're in space, that doesn't happen. No. So you don't realise that your bladder's filling up. So astronauts are taught just to go to the toilet every 2 hours, regardless of the situation. Yes, and so obviously if you're in a contained suit and you're out and about in space, well, let's move on from that.
Yeah. Sounds like a good idea to me.
So, despite what science fiction will tell you, humans can actually exist in space without spacesuits.
Really?
For about 15 seconds.
Okay.
So you wouldn't instantly die like you sometimes see and stuff, but those couple seconds probably wouldn't be very enjoyable.
No.
So your body would expand to about twice its normal size. So the Wikipedia article talking about this describes it more like an overworked bodybuilder than a balloon being overfilled, which is a really lovely mental image.
Oh.
You would be able to stay conscious for those 15 seconds, but then oxygen starvation would kick in and you'd pass out. And from that point on, you're basically done. You're finished. But some good news, your blood doesn't boil, as some people would suggest, because it remains pressurized within your body. And that would also stop you from snap freezing, as you see sometimes in some science fiction programs. Interestingly enough, your skin would actually be able to survive contact with the vacuum of space. It would just need some sort of compression fabric to stop it from expanding. So a strong pair of yoga pants would probably do the trick.
So you don't freeze to death. Your blood doesn't boil, but you do double in size.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, God, I'm sure that's any better, to be honest with you.
And then obviously you're not taking in any oxygen, so that would also screw you.
Yes. Yeah, I would totally. You're not going to survive it, totally. But just what a way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So I read a really interesting article on The Atlantic, which I'll put in the show notes, which is mostly about spacesuits and women and their history with NASA. So spacesuits are designed in what they describe as a Mr. Potato Head approach.
Okay.
You have 5 sizes, extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large. And then you have different pieces. So you've got arms, legs, upper torso, and lower torso. And the idea being that you can mix and match depending on the astronaut in question.
Right. So each of those pieces come in different sizes as well?
Yes, and they slot together like a Mr. Potato Head. So, for example, you can have medium arms with a large torso for someone who's only got short arms, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So they designed a system to fit as many people as possible. And their plan was, unfortunately, for women to just wear the same size as men, but in a smaller size, obviously, which didn't work for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
This got worse in the 90s when budget cuts forced NASA to completely stop making extra small and then small size suits because most of their astronauts were using medium or large. And this is one in a history of bad decisions, shall we say, that NASA was famous for making when it came to women. There's a very famous story that in the 1980s, when female astronaut Sally Ryder was asked by sheepish technicians if 100 tampons would be enough for her 7-day mission in space.
You can tell that's a staff by mainly men and male engineers, can't you?
Yeah, a whole bunch of nerdy dudes with big thick glasses kind of like pushing the other one to ask the question because they were too nervous to do it.
Oh, man.
Yeah, so right now on the ISS, which is the International Space Station, there are 6 suits, 6 complete suits, 2 each in medium, large, and extra large. However, only 4 of these are prepped for immediate spacewalks, 1 medium, 2 large, and 1 extra large, because that's the one that those are the ones that get used the most. The other 2 are up there for kind of like spare parts and would work, but would require quite a lot of modification to be used for EVA purposes, extravehicular activity purposes. Put my teeth in for that one.
Yeah, it's not an easy acronym to say, is it?
No. Incredibly, NASA are actually still using the same suit designs from more than 40 years ago because developing new ones is really expensive.
Sure.
Which has caused some issues as the suits were only designed for 15 years of service. So they're slight problems there, and because they have limited supplies, they have actually in the past been forced to choose astronauts for missions based on their size so that they can fit into the available suits.
Wow. So not based on the skill set.
No.
Or their PhD. No, your size. That's what matters.
And that's actually kind of hawks back to like the early space race days when they had really, really small spaceships. So if you look at some of the other people like Yuri Gagarin, they're actually quite small in stature because they needed small people to fit in these like small cockpits.
We need a jockey.
Yeah.
Can you run me a jockey?
Exactly, yeah. No, squeeze them in and slam the door shut. So recently, NASA have actually revealed their updated design. They spent something like $200 million in the past decade developing spacesuits, and they, at the end of 2019, unveiled the Artemis generation. So one of the biggest problems they had was knowing what they needed to design the suit for. So they get different objectives, being a government organisation, from basically different presidents and different administrations to what they should be targeting.
Every 4 years it changes.
Well, yeah, quite. And designing a suit if you're going to Mars is very different to designing one for the moon.
Sure.
All the rest of it. So this generation is designed for the moon, as their current objective is to put people back on the moon by 2024.
Right.
And one of the new features will allow astronauts to actually walk on the moon instead of that funny little bunny hop that you see in the Apollo astronauts.
Absolutely, on the old TV pictures.
Yes, exactly. So all of the Apollo astronauts, when they went up, all had the same suit, so they all had the same limitation that basically meant you couldn't walk on the moon, you had to do those little hops.
Right.
So how many men, and unfortunately it is only men, how many men do you think have walked on the moon?
Neil Armstrong... Then I'm out. How many men?
Buzz Aldrin was with Neil.
Was he?
Yes.
He got out as well. I was supposed he was the first man in Neil Armstrong, wasn't he? So okay, fair enough. So there's two of them. So one of them stayed. I don't know the third man's name, but he stayed in the pod, didn't he?
Yeah. No one knows his name.
No, I forgot his name.
Unfortunately. Actually, if you're mentioning Neil Armstrong, he insisted that he said one small step for a man.
Yes.
And not one small step for man.
Yeah, I read that. It was a misquote. It was
he insisted that's what he said. Sorry, carry on. How many do you think walked on the moon?
I don't know. So we're talking from 1969 through to now.
Well, yeah, basically ever. Yeah.
Ever, yeah, absolutely. And obviously a long time ago, they've not gone back to the moon. I would say, 7 men.
So it's 12.
Oh.
There were 6 separate Apollo missions that landed on the moon, and each mission had 2 people on board. So there have been 12 people.
Okay.
Can you name the only sport to have been played on the moon?
Soccer.
No, it's golf. So Alan Shepard, he took up an 8-iron head to the moon. He attached it to a lunar sample collection device and used it to drive against 3 balls, which are still there on the moon, obviously, because there's no gravity, so they're exactly where he hit them. It's estimated that the balls travelled for a mile each.
Wow.
Which would mean that he is the man with the longest golf drive in history. that record has not been equalled on Earth.
I bet he told that at dinner parties after he got back.
Yeah, well, you would, wouldn't you?
Yeah, totally up that up.
So in 2017, 18,000 people applied to NASA to become astronauts.
Wow.
And of those 18,000, probably only 8 to 14 will get the opportunity to actually become an astronaut candidate.
Wow.
Which is only the first stage. That process alone takes 18 months of testing. And if they make it through that part, they become an astronaut candidate, and then they start their basic training, which takes another 2 years from there.
And obviously, these 18,000 people are very clever to begin with.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, probably some of them aren't.
Yeah, true.
Shits and giggles, but yeah, you can bet that it's the best of the best that are applying for this.
Yes.
Funnily enough, Hillary Clinton, when she was a young girl, applied to NASA. She wrote them a letter saying, what do I need to do to become an astronaut? And they wrote back to her and said, we don't accept girls.
Listen to know what kind of bullet they dodged.
Yes, yeah, well, quite. So part of the training is learning Russian, spoken and read, and astronauts are basically expected to be fluent in Russian, because the ISS is a joint collaborative effort, mostly between America and Russia. So a lot of the systems on board are Russian and have Russian writing all over them. So a Russian language test is part of the final process to step from a candidate to an actual astronaut.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to get up there, would you, and not know what the button means you're going to press?
No. Apparently, when they first started the ISS, there was some debate between the Russians and the Americans, with the Russians refusing to let the Americans use anything that the Russians had brought up without paying for it first. So apparently the Americans then did the same, and where this became a particular problem was, I believe, that the toilets were brought up by the Americans. There was
move, Russia.
Some big debate there, yeah. But apparently that's not the case anymore, and they get on very well once they're up there. But I think that would have been hilarious.
That's right, yeah. I've got to go within 2 hours. Let me use the toilet.
Would have been a great sitcom scenario, I think.
I reckon. Then the argument's back down on Earth about it. Oh, my God.
Yeah. So the most famous part of the astronauts' training is the so-called vomit comet. Are you familiar with this?
I don't think I am, no.
Okay, so the vomit comet is a plane which flies up very, very high, kind of basically like does a steep incline and then kind of like free falls for a little while.
Wow.
So this creates a weightlessness environment on board the plane for about 20-25 seconds. And obviously this is pretty much the only way you can demonstrate to someone a weightless environment without kind of like doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And apparently the ratio is something like 1 in 3 people get sick on board the plane, hence the lovely title.
So let me just picture this. You got this plane in free fall. So obviously they're weightless. One of them is vomiting. At least one of them is vomiting.
Well, one of every 3.
Yeah. Okay. So there's at least one in there. God knows how many are vomiting in total. There's at least one vomiting, which is obviously forming. It's weightless as well. And then when the plane levels out,
plop 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 plop. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No! The smell.
That can't be a pleasant environment, can it?
Oh no! How are they? They can't be strapped in, I suppose. If they're experiencing weightlessness, they've got to be able to float.
No, they're just free floating. Yeah, and you can actually do this privately. There are companies that will let you hire a plane to go off and do it if you really want to experience that joyous image. But
wow,
liquids in space are a big problem. So apparently, things like when if an astronaut sneezes while inside their spacesuit, that can be tricky.
It's floating around in there.
Yeah,
right,
or straight up on the inside of their helmet. That's not nice.
You can't clean it, can you?
No. If you cry in space, the tears don't fall down, so they form and they kind of like just sit in your eye, basically, which is possibly the most emo thing ever. Yeah, they just stick in your eye, which is not very nice.
No.
And apparently one trick that astronauts use if they have like a facial itch whilst in a spacesuit is to stick a little bit of Velcro on the inside, so they can kind of like rub their face up against that if you've got like that itch on the front of your nose and you can't get in to scratch.
That's a clever idea, yeah.
Yeah, it's clever, huh?
You wouldn't be able to, like you say, you wouldn't be able to scratch it. No. For a few hours.
So whilst the first American missions were going up, the Russians were doing their Soyuz series of trips. The cosmonauts on board the Soyuz aboard the Soyuz craft were given an emergency landing survival kit. Just in case they kind of like crash down to Earth in an unexpected place.
Sure.
Part of that kit included a shotgun in case they landed in an area with bears.
Is good Russian shotgun.
Yes, yeah.
God, you wouldn't let that go off by mistake, would you?
Well, no, quite. That's a great thing to have in space.
That's right. I'm sure they weren't using it for the Americans in case they came across one.
Well, yeah, that was the official reason. Maybe,
yeah,
maybe that was the unofficial reason, yeah.
It's for Russian bear, yeah, da. Yeah, right, mate.
So talking of Russian ingenuity compared to American ingenuity, this is my thing to finish on here. Do you know the old joke that when they realised that the ballpoint pens would not work in space, NASA spent millions developing a pen that would work upside down, any temperature and vacuum and all the rest of it. When they were given the same problem, Russian cosmonauts took pencils.
Says a lot, doesn't it?
Yes. So, unfortunately, that is basically bollocks. It's funny.
Really?
It's funny, but it is unfortunately bollocks. I'm actually incorrect on a number of levels. So, firstly, NASA did use pencils for many of its early missions. They quickly realised, however, that pencils weren't ideal because small pieces of the pencil lead would break off, and then in zero gravity, it's not ideal. They go floating around your ship.
Yeah.
Broken pieces get in people's eyes, in machinery, and most worryingly, it's quite flammable. And obviously, a fire in a spaceship is not something you want to mess with.
Oh, I suppose graphite,
Yeah. So early flights by both Russians and Americans did use pencils. Russians used something called grease pencils, which I'd never heard of before, and that's quite as gross as it sounds. So the space pen was actually entirely funded by the Fisher Pen Company.
Oh, really?
Which was set up by inventor and engineer Paul Fisher.
Sure.
So the way it works is basically it's a sealed pressurized ink cartridge that allows it to work in zero gravity. It also works underwater, in liquid, or in extreme temperatures. They say between -50 and 400 degrees Fahrenheit, so quite a range.
Wow. Very clever.
It's estimated that he did spend about $1 million developing it, but he's more than made that back.
Yeah, exactly.
Every flight that NASA has made from Apollo 7 onwards used Fisher pens. As soon as it was developed and released, NASA bought 400 pens, and the Soviets followed by buying 100 of them for their cosmonauts as well. So those space pens were used by both Russians and Americans from pretty much the early days onwards. So all of the Apollo missions that landed on the moons all had those space pens.
Very clever man.
Yes, indeed. And you can buy them to this day. There are two main models. There's the AG7, I believe it's called, which is like the long, regular-looking biro. Those are the ones that the astronauts carried, and then they do the little bullet ones, which are like small ones that basically kind of like fold in half sort of thing. You take the lid off and turn it around, and that gives you a full-size pen. And I carry one of those in my pocket everywhere I go because they're incredibly useful little pocket pen. Yes.
How cool is that?
Yeah. So there you go, astronauts, space and spacesuits and all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, very interesting. I didn't know any most of that stuff. That's very clever.
Yeah. The science involved in getting those guys up there is both incredible and also terrifying when you see how slapdash and hazardous it was in the early days.
Oh yeah, can you imagine? Yeah, totally. Very different health and safety back then.
Yeah, quite. Well, I mean, just when you consider the computing power they had available in the 60s compared to
totally.
Now, so much of that was done with like slide rulers and calculators and so forth. And actually, that was mostly done by women on the NASA team, although it wasn't kind of acknowledged at the time. Being an astronaut, space was all very like manly, and they all drove around in these Corvettes. Which the one, I think it was Alan Shepard actually bought one himself, and then the company realised the PR availability of having all the astronauts drive Corvettes, so they gave them very good rates to all buy Corvettes. So basically,
racing around Florida.
Well, exactly, yeah. So basically, all of the Apollo astronauts all drove the same 2-seater sports car.
Nice. Never miss a marketing opportunity.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Very cool.
There we go. NASA and space and stuff.
I like it.
Thank you very much for listening. If you have any thoughts or contributions to make on either of the two subjects that we've spoken about this evening, you can find us on Twitter, on Facebook, and our website, which is welovetheinternet.co.uk. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear your thoughts or opinions. Please send them across. And until next time, thank you very much and goodbye.
See ya.